channeling Ronald Reagan, I paid for this microphone, so I'll make a couple of comments. My first thing is, Roy, when you were talking about the trend, and we're only halfway to the peak, and back in the 90s, it reminded me of the joke about the guy who jumped out of the building, and halfway down, somebody says, "How's it going?" "Well, great so far." So one question I wanted to ask, Rich, you cover politics, obviously daily, but really for anybody. Roy said that, the silence, and you mentioned it too, of elected officials is sort of remarkable on this. We have a presidential election coming up. What have the Republican presidential candidates said about immigration? Are there differences among them? What's the story?
Well, they've said very little except for, again, on the border. And look, there's a robust debate on the border, which is great. You have the Biden administration taking fire from its own party on the border because the situation is so unsustainable. But on this issue, the overall number, including legal immigration, we're just up against an almost unbreakable wall of conventional wisdom that says it is almost by definition good and can't be questioned. And that assumption is just deeply embedded in our politics across both parties and just hard to break. I don't think there hasn't been a question in any debates about legal immigration, right? I don't. DeSantis might have a policy for more skills. I'm not sure, but it's that I don't know is telling enough that this issue has had just zero prominence.
Right. Next year is going to be the 100th anniversary of the 1924 immigration bill that Coolidge signed, and that basically it didn't stop immigration, but it dialed it back and it ended the Great Wave. One of the charges against the law is the way it reduced immigration, because it used these national origins quotas where there were a certain number per year allowed from Italy and a certain number from Ireland and what have you. And the point was ostensibly to maintain the ethnic balance of the country, that sort of thing. How much do you think that this, Roy, you're more the historian here, but whoever wants to weigh in, how much do you think that has colored and shaped the discussion about, other current legislation to reduce immigration?
Well, usually the winners of a battle write the history, but for the most part, the losers of that battle in 1924 wrote the history. And it did have a racial component, not directly, but because it was related to the percentage of every ethnic group in the country at various times. And it did focus on the who as well as the how many. The fact is that it was the how many that mattered, that really mattered. That was what saved. That's what not saved, but rescued the descendants of American slavery for the next 50 years, as they had it was the reduction in the numbers. So
in other
I think
words, if they'd been Irish or Italian, it wouldn't have made one difference.
But the fact that you can point back and say, look, we've done this before, and it was racial or ethnic or what. The fact is, you don't have to do it that way. That's the point. And there are indications that Coolidge did have a problem with the bill because of the Japanese part of it. It's a little more complicated than just that he's concerned about the Japanese. It was a treaty and all, but his interest was overall the numbers. At that point, it was okay to talk about maintaining a culture in the United States, and so there's a lot of concern about that. Does the United States have a culture? We can't get people to talk about numbers. Right now, pretty hard to say that there is an American culture that we want to preserve that you should cut for that. But yeah, it's undercut us. But I think what we have to look at is what were the results of that bill,
right?
Not what were maybe all the intentions. And but again, you had the top progressive religious leaders. Almost all the black leaders. I'm not aware of any black leader that was opposed to it, and the unions were totally behind it.
Right. So
it's not exactly like you're talking about some right-wing piece of legislation.
Right. So in a sense, it's almost, with those caveats of sort of flipping a reversal of the road to hell is paved with good intentions. You could end up with good policy based at least partly on bad intentions.
Yeah.
But there's no reason to revisit that kind
Of course.
position. You could just restructure U.S. immigration policy to bring the numbers down, to lessen the impact on the less educated labor market, to facilitate assimilation, to take the pressure off of schools and hospitals and physical infrastructure, to lessen the social service costs and so forth. There's no reason you would have to mention at all the ethnic composition. I don't think anybody
has a single member of Congress
ever mentioned that.
ever suggested.
Yeah, I don't. It's a
doing it by race
no
or
one wants
ethnicity.
that.
No,
Right. So no one wants that.
It's a total straw man.
Right, exactly. So it's
It
just
is,
a
but
straw
it's
man.
a straw man that's, got a lot of straw in it. I guess is the way to
Well,
say it.
another thing's happened is just the suspicion or opposition to high numbers that used to exist on the left, union sentiment and the rest, it's just totally collapsed.
Yeah.
So this is why your experience out in Chicago is so important. If you can reunite some of that opposition from that part of the political spectrum, it could create a little bit of a permission structure for Republicans to talk about it more as well.
And for some Democrats who, it would take a tremendous amount of courage for a Democrat to speak up right now, a Democratic office holder to speak up right now.
Right.
Even though the polls show that on many of these issues, the majority of Democratic voters, they want to end chain migration. They want to bring the numbers down. They want to end the visa lottery. They want mandatory verify. But they're not, for all kinds of other reasons, that's not going to make them vote for a Republican, even though the Democrats are against all those things they're for, the
Right.
Democratic officials.
Mark, can we revisit the one other aspect about the past that I touched on? And since Roy was brought it up and you've always been thinking about it, I'm interested. The idea that, look, when immigrants arrived in the past, when we were at 15% before, they were arriving in America with a lot of self-confidence about what we wanted from the immigrants. Now, you've made a lot of this in the past. In fact, I would say you're the person who's developed this argument the most, and I think it's worth talking about it. One of the ways in which immigration is different today is that America is so different, right? No one brings up assimilation because we don't even have an agreement on what we want from the immigrants. And what that means is immigrants are arriving in a society where they get all kinds of conflicted messages.
Right.
So there are other ways in which it's different too, right? You have technology facilitating travel and communication and things like that. But this fact that the elites had an idea that Brandeis was tapping into. People didn't react to Brandeis's speech and say, oh, that's horrible. What do you mean? We have no national aspirations. We have no national ideals or culture. That's not what people said. They said, yeah, that sounds right. We can have immigrants, but this is what we would expect. That's all gone.
Right.
And doesn't that mean immigration is fundamentally different today because the
Right.
country is so
But it
fundamentally
was
different?
that effort, Americanization effort, was so comprehensive. You had voluntary leagues do it. You had companies doing it. You had everyone distributing, English language pamphlets and educating people after hours about America. It's like, can you imagine Apple and Meta doing that today? Right? It's completely a different world.
Right, right, and that's the point. Is that that's the point I was making. Is that our elites have basically given up on the idea or rejected the idea of assimilation, and that's kind of what as a political question I wanted to ask on is how central is this issue of not just immigration in general, but insisting on continued high levels of immigration. How central is that to the disconnect? The political disconnect, the consequences of which we're seeing between the public at large and our leadership classes. Elites people use, but frankly, having watched that hearing with 3 presidents of top universities, I'm not sure elite is an adjective I would ever use anymore, but the leadership classes of not just the United States, really the Western world, business, government, et cetera, really are disconnected from the interests and concerns of the public. And this issue on the level of immigration seems to be one of the key areas.
Yeah. So you talked about the political turmoil we had around these high levels and how we haven't seen it or even any debate. But there is a level of turmoil about this. Subterranean, maybe in America. Certainly, you see it in Europe. But there are 3 big issues that I think made the opening for Trump, where there was this disconnect you're talking about: trade, China, and immigration. Trade policy has changed. China policy has changed. Biden's basically accepted Trump's China policy. What hasn't changed is immigration. Tougher rhetoric around the border, but not that broader debate that I think gets to the more fundamental disconnect you're talking about.
And even the tougher rhetoric is accompanying huge increase in the number of people being waved into the country. This is a question, it sounds kind of wonky, but a lot of people follow the issue are concerned about this. Are there 20 million, 30 million, 40 million illegal aliens or not? In other words, how reliable is this government data that we're basing all? Because we're not making any of this up. You're just slicing and dicing something that's anyone out there could just download the data and do this to.
That's right. Look, we can't say for certain, and the way in which the data is constructed has limitations. It does miss people. And remember, without going into too much detail, all modern surveys, you've never seen a survey, whether it's, whether Americans like this soap or this shampoo or who they're going to vote for, are all weighted based on what the person taking the survey thinks is the actual distribution of people in the country. There's no such thing as a truly random survey anymore. There are, but not any that matter. So this data is all weighted. And the question is, are the weights constructed in such a way as to capture what's happening or what's happened? And the answer is probably not. They probably do miss some people. The weights are a problem. And then there's just the problem of finding the immigrants. But I would tell you that they do find in the survey, they ask people, when did you come? And they find lots of people say, yeah, I just came. And then a lot of those people are from Latin America with very modest levels of education. So we know we're picking up a lot of people based on all the prior research from Pew or Migration Policy Institute or the Center for Migration Studies or the Census Bureau itself and others. We are picking up a lot of illegal immigrants. And when you do that, I'm going to explain very briefly how you estimate illegal immigration, and it's way more complicated. You look at but here's it. Ready? This is the foreign-born number, so it's 50 million. And we think, based on how many people we've actually let in and estimates of out-migration, there's 40 million legal immigrants. The difference between the two is your base number for illegal immigration, which you then would underestimate it. That's not how everyone does it, but that is a very mainstream way. That's how the government did when it used to put out more regular estimates. So when you do that kind of calculation, you get the kind of number that the illegal population now is probably 12, 13 million. But I think what throws people off is but it doesn't seem like it's grown, but they forget all the people get deported, go home, die, and we legalize people constantly. And that population cannot be added to by births. Yes, there are 4, 5, 5.5 million children of illegal immigrants in the United States born here, but they're all U.S. born and by definition are not illegal immigrants. That's a different question of whether we should give automatic citizenship to the children born of illegal immigrants. Final point. If there were 20 million illegal immigrants in the United States, we would expect that for things like birth data. When we look at Census Bureau data and we look at birth data, they're not that out of whack. If there were lots more people in the United States, we would expect them to have children. Now, maybe they're all celibate and they don't have children, but one would expect children. Another area would be school enrollment. When you look at Census Bureau data and compare it to administrative data, you don't get that big of a difference. So that would tend to suggest that the Census Bureau's data, whether it's the monthly data we're using here, they have a big annual survey, those things probably provide a pretty sound basis for thinking about illegal immigration. Could the number be bigger than we think? Yes. Could it be 1 million, maybe even 2 million bigger than we think? Yes. Could it be 10 million bigger than we think? Boy, that's very hard to believe given the administrative data. We don't see those kids in public schools. They're not showing up in emergency rooms and those kinds of numbers. We have other data from other countries that doesn't say it. We don't have birth data that show that. So it seems extremely unlikely. I would say never, but I'm extraordinarily skeptical of that perspective. That I think the number is around now probably close to 13 million.
So our last question here really for anybody. What's the solution? Is an immigration moratorium the way to go? What does an immigration moratorium even mean? What should we do? Basically, because we're at the end of this year. So on the 100th anniversary of the 1924 immigration law that shut off the Great Wave, what should we be doing? Roy, you want to take a first whack at it?
Well, there's been a lot of controversy over the decades in the immigration restrictions movement about whether you should do sort of zero-based planning or do it by categories. My opinion is that just like you're not going to get the federal government, Congress, to start each year at 0 and then just build a budget from there. They're going to start with last year's budget. That's the way to start. And I think we have to deal with categories. So it is it does have to be somewhat about who. I think the key thing right now is somebody said this, first thing is to acknowledge that this is historic. Number 2, have the debate about where are we headed? Do we want to head there? Number 3, what I hope, and I think the American people are here, this is enough. And we need it. We need that percentage to start going down. We'll be a better, stronger nation, and the people who are here as foreign born will be better off as well as all the Americans. And at that point, you say, okay, if we've got to slow it down, where do you cut? And I know it's ancient history now, but Bill Clinton's he nominated Barbara Jordan as the chair. The Republicans and Democrats formed the so-called Barbara Jordan Commission, and they had pretty much the answers that are still there, which is chain migration does nothing for the American people, for the national interest. The visa lottery doesn't. So you chop those out. There's a couple other things there. You knock the numbers down by about a third right away, and start to see how and it starts to be incremental. We really ought to. The problem is we think we can only do something like this every 30 or 40 years. We ought to be more like Australia. Not that Australia has a great immigration policy, but they do look at this every couple of years.
They revisit it constantly,
and so that I think that's, to be practical, that's maybe the best we could hope for.
Any thoughts, Rich?
Yeah, I would just say I'm not the expert that you, Steve, or Roy are, but I think the thin wedge to get into the question of numbers is skills, because the popular imagination is we're overwhelmingly letting in computer scientists who are going to start the new Google, and we're just not. And I think when you confront people with that fact, say we can choose anyone, we're not anti-immigrant, it's just this current system makes no sense. That might be the most politically saleable way to get into this.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, look, short term, you've got to restore things like the migration agreements we had with the Central American countries. You obviously need to remain in Mexico. You need to be using expedited removal. There are a bunch of things we could do. We obviously long term need asylum reform. You can't use a system that was designed 40 years ago, 50 years ago for a tiny number of people in an era of mass travel, mass information, and mass migration. You just need a different system. You can't so we have an asylum system that's totally dysfunctional now. If you were to apply for asylum today, you wouldn't get a hearing maybe for 10 years in court. So, it's a situation that's untenable. So you'd have to restore that, the control over the border, dramatically deter people, start immediately by deporting people, or removal is the technical term, people who are here, who've already had a day in court. Remember, our system is so weak, so unrobust, whatever terms you like, that we don't even make people who've had their day in court, usually many days in court, and have been ordered removed by an immigration judge. We don't actually remove those people. They're called the so-called deportation absconders. That's hundreds of thousands of people. The other things you'd need to do is to have an E-Verify. Americans overwhelmingly support the idea of employers being forced to verify that new workers are legally here. We actually collect that data and we don't enforce it. Would that solve everything? No. Are there ways of beating that? Of course. But it would have a huge impact, and then we could ratchet it up. So I guess other points are, as Roy said, get rid of chain migration and the lottery and look at each category hard with the goal of trying to figure out what's best for the country, rather than letting special interests dominate this debate, which is usually what happens. But of course, you'd need a debate to actually do any of that. A debate we don't have.
You need to have a debate to have a debate.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I just want to say that Steve has raised, I almost have to say the overworked word, but there are a number of existential questions that Steve has raised in his paper about who we are as a nation. What is a nation? It's you've done a good job of pulling all that together.
Here.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, everybody. The paper that Steve was talking about, that we've all been talking about, is on our website at cis.org. And if you tuned in late, you can watch this whole panel. The recording of it is also going to be on our website, cis.org. And I'll just put in a plug for our podcast, Parsing Immigration Policy, weekly interview podcast on immigration. It's in all the usual podcast places. And that's it for now. Thank you for tuning in, and thanks to the panelists for participating.